Hi, I'm Christopher Rea, and welcome to this brief video introduction to the contemporary Chinese writer Yu Hua. I've also made 3 video lectures about Yu Hua's 2-part novel, Brothers. Yu Hua is a personal favorite. I remember reading him in college and writing an honors thesis about him, and I've enjoyed his works ever since and enjoyed following his career. He's still an active writer and keeps coming up with new surprises. So if you've never read Yu Hua before, you're in luck because he's available widely in translation. If you have read Yu Hua before, you may still be having nightmares. In this video lecture, I want to talk a little bit about his life, highlight a few selective works from his career, and also talk a little bit about how the nature of the business has changed for writers in China. Novelists are not just novelists anymore. Often they are also critical commentators and pundits. Yu Hua is without a doubt modern China's most famous dentist turned writer. There are other writers who were in medicine first, like Lu Xun. However, his backstory, I think, has resonated with a lot of readers in this magical, amazing transformation into one of modern China's most celebrated writers. He first came to national attention in the 1980s with what people regarded as some quite violent literary experiments, and he was part of this avant-garde coterie of writers after the Cultural Revolution. But he has undergone several shifts in his writing, particularly in the 1990s and in the 21st century as well, so I'll talk about those. I also want to touch briefly on one of the themes that Yu Hua has identified in his own writings, this search for one kind of reality. How do you best capture reality in fiction? Yu Hua is a familiar name and a familiar face in modern China. He is one of those few writers who can write one novel and then coast on that for the better part of a decade because it's so commercially successful. He was born in 1960 in Hangzhou, and he grew up in a small coastal town near Shanghai. And he's mentioned that he doesn't tend to set his novels or fiction in cities or in villages or purely rural areas. He usually sets them in small towns. This is very different from many other writers. Both of his parents were doctors, and they worked for a while in a hospital. And in fact, the entire family lived in a hospital for a while. Yu Hua has written and spoken quite extensively about some childhood experiences that many people would consider quite chilling or even uncanny and unsettling, like hearing the cries of the bereaved in the morgue right near where he lived. However, to him as a kid, this was nothing scary. The morgue was actually a very nice place to be on a summer day. He has also recounted how his father pressured him to become a barefoot dentist. So this is not like he went to dentistry school and learned about advanced techniques. He was mostly just pulling rotten teeth out of people's mouths. And he says that he hated this job. This was the job with the worst view in the world, as he put it. And so when he had the opportunity to start writing stories, and to move into a cultural institute and actually write for a living as a salaried writer, this was a rare opportunity and he jumped on it. He submitted a story to a Beijing journal, and one of them actually accepted it after many rejections. And he was invited up to Beijing to go sightseeing and to do a little light editing and work with the editors before his story was finally published. And this was a tremendous breakout moment for him. Yu Hua has been a professional writer since the 1980s and has been remarkably successful by any standards. His works sell by the hundreds of thousands or even millions. They are continually reprinted. Chinese critics and foreign critics alike have lauded his works as some of the best works coming out of China. They've been translated into dozens of languages and received literary awards from around the world. You can read some of his early works in The Past and the Punishments, translated by Andrew F. Jones. Some of these stories are truly sensational and truly unsettling. On the road to 18, we have this young man who is leaving home for the first time, and he hitches a ride on an apple truck. The truck breaks down, and then all of these villagers come out and start to steal the apples, and he protests, but the driver of the truck seems undisturbed by this. And when people start pelting the young man with apples, the driver just laughs and walks off. And this formerly optimistic young man is just left bruised and bleeding by the side of the road. One kind of reality is another example where the cause and effect, there's like no justification given for all of the violence that we see here. We have infighting between siblings who murder each other's children, and then one kills the other, and the corpse is then lovingly taken apart by a series of surgeons, piece by piece, organ by organ. Classical love is this chilling adaptation of an earlier trope from pre-modern Chinese literature of the young scholar who is going to go to the capital to seek fame and fortune in the examinations, and he meets a beautiful woman along the way. After failing the examination, however, he returns to the town to find that the lady has died. The place is in famine. People are butchering kids alive, and so we have this horrible cannibalistic tale evolving out of what should have been a classical romance. But the classical love that we find is this scholar clutching what is left of her corpse. Yu Hua has collected some of his short fiction into this anthology, and he has often cited Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Franz Kafka as particular influences on these early works of experimentalist fiction. As a writer of avant-garde stories who emerged during the high culture fever of the 1980s, Yu Hua is usually grouped together with Ge Fei, Su Tong, and Can Xue, all of them prolific writers who are still active today and available widely in translation. He wrote his first novel in 1992, which features a pair of brothers, just like in Brothers from 2005-2006. This is a novel that actually has two different Chinese titles. To Live is his most famous novel. This is primarily the story of Fu Gui, an old man who a young man in search of old stories has met on a summer day. And Fu Gui tells him the story of his life and how he ended up becoming an old man alone with an ox, as all of his family members, one by one, died off during the vicissitudes of modern China's cultural and revolutionary history. This is a novel that's often been called very existentialist, in that we just end up with a stubborn man who keeps stubbornly living. And what does it really mean to live, despite all of these hardships and all of these sufferings? This is a novel that has resonated particularly strongly with Chinese readers, who have seen modern Chinese history as one of repeated cycles of very personal individual suffering. This is a novel that has been adapted into an excellent film by Zhang Yimou, and also into a multi-part TV serial called Fu Gui, named after its main character. Chronicle of a Blood Merchant is another chilling tale about a man who goes to bodily extremes of selling his own blood in order to support his family. This is a novel that has been adapted not in China, but in Korea. I discuss his long two-part novel Brothers in 3 other video lectures. Part 1 of this novel is set during the Cultural Revolution. Part 2 is set during Reform-era China. And this work of farce is a tour de force. Yu Hua's follow-up work was a much shorter novel called The Seventh Day, which is distinct in that the narrator is dead. One of the significant transitions in Yu Hua's career was to move into writing for the mass media, both in China and particularly abroad. So for several years, he was writing opinion pieces for the New York Times. Most of these opinion pieces comment on contemporary Chinese politics and social life. And Yu Hua is just one of several different modern Chinese writers, such as Liao Yiwu, Ma Jian, and Yan Lianke, who have written for English language media. So we see a transition here from just writing purely fictional stories into representing what are the truths, what is the inside story about modern China. Yu Hua has also toured the world for years as a literary celebrity, and some of his writing practice has been tied up in this international lecture circuit. Here's just one example from China in 10 Words. This is an essay collection that Yu Hua wrote in Chinese, published in Taiwan. It still has not been published in mainland China. This is a work that takes a glossary approach to modern China, defining it in a very reductive sense. But actually, these are not just essays, they're also 10 different stories that weave together Yu Hua's personal reading and life experiences. One of these chapters, called Disparity or Chaju, is adapted from a lecture that Yu Hua wrote and delivered at the University of British Columbia. And in that chapter, he actually includes an anecdote of a question or comment that he got from an audience member, a Chinese student studying abroad. So this is to say, it's not like the writer writes and then they travel and they sell their book. No, sometimes the travel and the interaction between writer and reader is part of the creative process. Yu Hua has claimed that all of his writing has been aimed at a single goal of getting closer to reality. But given that his work is often farcical or seems to be very unrealistic, it could be very exaggerated, absurdly violent, what exactly does he mean by reality? Reality, after all, could mean several different things. It could mean things that we have experienced, things that we all share in common, things that are common to Chinese people, for example. And so they will ring true or not ring true. Or are we talking about reality as a type of fidelity of representation, that things are observable, and therefore they should be represented in a way that matches how we've perceived them in other spheres? Or are we talking about some type of psychological realism, where, okay, maybe there's some kind of external objective reality out there, but the ways that an individual might perceive it could be entirely different from a different person. So one thing that you see may make you happy, but if I see the same thing, it might make me sad, based on my own psychological or mental state. So how one answers this question of what exactly we mean by reality has tremendous implications for how one writes. Sometimes it's useful to have a little bit of contrast to define a vague term like reality or realism. So take, for example, the 才子佳人, the scholar beauty romance. This is a genre and a mode that was very common in imperial China, and one that was abhorred by later so-called realist writers who considered it to be completely unrealistic. This is a type of fantasy writing that focused not on the common people, but on the elite, on aristocrats or people of wealth and rank, or it had a fantasy of upward social mobility where maybe you were a poor scholar before, but by dint of your literary prowess and intellectual capabilities, you could place first in the examinations and win the girl in the process. So this type of middle brow fiction was very popular and very formulaic, that you always had stock types like the brilliant, impoverished, handsome scholar and the beautiful, modest girl. And they happen to catch sight of each other by accident and their romance develops. And the plot arc of the romance is very, very conventional. And so we'll end with him placing first in the examination and them living happily ever after. Modern writers of the early 20th century like Zheng Zhenduo believed that we had had enough romance, enough of the sappiness. We needed blood and tears, because that is the reality, they believed, of real people in China. This trend has been tremendously strong and has carried into the socialist and post-socialist age. But it didn't take long for critics to note that this type of so-called realism could be taken to unrealistic extremes when you are drawing the lines very starkly, very black and white, and the representation of blood and tears and suffering and trauma becomes almost pornographic, like hardcore realism. Chinese communist policy added a whole new twist to the realism debate. The basic assumption was that literature and art should be by and for the people. It should be for the dispossessed. It should be for the majority. And the only way that you could ensure the authenticity and fidelity of representation was based on how close you as the writer or the artist got to the people. You had to actually have some real life experience with them in order to represent their lives faithfully. But there was a twist in that this should have a polemical and a pedagogical element, in that you're not just actually representing real life. You want to make it a little bit different. You want to make it a little bit better, more closer to the ideal than actual real life was. Because you wanted to inspire people. You wanted to uplift them. You want it to be a weapon that would destroy the bad and promote the good. We have a new genre coining called revolutionary realism. So how does revolutionary realism differ from real realism? The unintended consequences of this ideology-driven policy was that you had a lot of cultural representations devolving very quickly into stereotype, where you had larger-than-life heroes who were utterly predictable. And so many works were produced that just churned out the formula that it very quickly devolved into self-parody. You had a dangbagu, or party eight-legged essay, emerging. The eight-legged essay was a very formulaic type of writing that candidates for the civil service would submit in their examinations. So it's like everyone's undergoing a new type of ideological test here and just churning out the same stuff. Another question related to reality is, well, the reality of what? I think that two of many motifs that we find in Yu Hua's fiction, one is modern Chinese history. Yu Hua is very interested in the Cultural Revolution, but also earlier and later historical events. In many of Yu Hua's novels and stories, we also find young boys. So Yu Hua seems very interested in the young male childhood and coming of age experience. But for decades, Yu Hua has been representing his one type of reality as shot through with violence and cruelty that takes on an even macabre, horrific tone. It's not enough that people are killed. Their corpses have to be violated or dissected. Not that it's all gloom and doom. Often the deaths and the violence is represented in a very comical mode. Things are quite funny. Things are absurd. Things make you laugh despite your revulsion at what's going on within the plot of the story. And so just to take a couple of examples, in To Live, we have Fu Gui, the main character's father, dying by falling off an outhouse platform while he is taking a dump. The scatology comes back in Brothers, in which Baldi Li's biological father actually drowns in excrement when he's trying to peep at women's bottoms under the partition that separates the men's side from the women's side in the public outhouse. So many readers have observed that Yu Hua's novels don't actually seem all that realistic, and his response is that I may write surrealistic and absurdist novels, but that's because of the increasingly pervasive absurdity of Chinese society. But I'm still a realist writer. China's reality is stranger than fiction, and I'm simply representing that reality. Yu Hua has also exalted in the vicarious appeal of fiction, in which you can see your own reality reflected in someone else's works, no matter whether you're rich or poor or what part of the world you live in. Yu Hua's fiction is widely available in translation, both his short fiction and his longer fiction, including the novels that I mentioned earlier in this presentation. He has also been exhaustively studied, and these are just a few of the scholars who have written about Yu Hua's works. But even though Yu Hua is a writer who has been in the public eye, who has been widely translated and widely studied, I believe that his works are well worth rereading, and so I invite you to join me for an exploration of some of the surprises in the novel Brothers.